Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday, and welcome to the Chamber's Inside the Capitol, a Pulse on Policy series. We got a good one for you today. My name is Laura Huffman, and I'm the proud president and CEO of the Austin Chamber of Commerce. And let me just say this, the business community is hard at work here in Austin. I think we've seen a lot of evidence that Austin is having a strong comeback from the pandemic. We had a banner year last year with some economic development, but there is also another side of the economy in the tourism, restaurants, bars, where there's still a lot of suffering there. And so our job is to make sure that we connect you to the information that you need to be a successful business. And guess what? Every couple of years, that means it's policy time at the Capitol. We are entering into a legislative session that will be like no other. And I'm really excited today to have Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar with us. He is, in essence, CFO of the world's 9th largest economy. And Comptroller Hegar monitors Texas finances to ensure that we maintain strong fund balances as well as a well-designed budget. He was recently named Texan of the Year by the Texas Legislative Conference. And according to the Texas Constitution, at the beginning of each regular legislative session, the comptroller must submit a statement showing the state's financial condition and estimating the revenue it can expect to receive during the next 2-year period. In other words, at the beginning of every session, Comptroller Hegar has the poll seat, and he establishes the ground rules and the framework within which policy can happen from a financial perspective. I'm really excited about having you here today, Comptroller Hegar. Known you for a long time, and I think that Texas is in really, really good hands with you at the helm as the CFO. I also want to thank some of the partners that have helped us provide these series. It's just a really great way to connect you to what's happening on the policy front. So thank you to our corporate sustainers, Amazon, HNTB, and Texas Gas Service. Thank you to AECom, Metro, Google, and HDR. Always there at the helm with us. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Tamara, who is going to give the comptroller a moment to give us some opening comments and then lots of questions. So load up your questions. We're going to be monitoring that. Tamara Fields is here with us today. She runs our policy committee for the Chamber of Commerce. And thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you. Let's see if I'm on yet.
You are on.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. And thank you, Laura. You know, as she indicated, I'm Tamara Fields. I am on the executive board for the Austin Chamber of Commerce and always extremely excited to support the initiatives that we put forward to help our businesses and our economy be strong. I'm also lead our Austin office where we have our own set of employees here in the community. And think it's so important that we have these types of conversations. As Laura indicated, Glenn Hegar is our Chief Financial Officer. He's the state treasurer, check writer, tax collector, procurement officer, and revenue estimator. It's a job that's particularly important these days as states address budget concerns and honestly, the impacts of the COVID pandemic. I think for Texas, that we are unique that a large amount of our revenue comes from oil and gas. And so even before the pandemic, we had weakness in oil and gas markets. You know, CFO of the world's 9th largest economy, as Laura indicated, Hegar is charged with maintaining the state's fiscal health, right? He served both in the Texas House and Senate, and he's gained a reputation for customer service, transparency in government, and conservative fiscal management. And I can also say, just from my own interactions with him, right, he's just really committed to the well-being of our state employees, state agencies, and all of us. He is about serving the community of Texas, and I know that I appreciate that being a part of our community. He is a graduate of Texas A&M University, and I forgive him for that, being a Longhorn myself. And also he's a graduate of St. Mary's University, where he earned a Master's of Arts and a law degree. And so we can continue going on. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate, being a native-born, like Laura, Texan, and a native-born Austinite, you know, Hegar is a 6th-generation Texas who grew up on farming land that's been in his family since the mid-1800s. He's joining us today from his home that he shares with his wife, Dara, and his children, Claire, Julia, and Jonah. He's going to kick off right now with just setting the context of our policy as we are in this legislative session. And then I have a lot of questions for him that we want to hear his perspective on where we're moving and how we're going to survive the pandemic and the disruption that we've had to endure over the last several months. So I'm now going to turn it over to Comptroller Hegar.
Thanks, Tamara. It's good to be with you. Good to be with you, Laura, and the group today. Obviously, I wish that we were in person, but so is the day we're continuing in 2021. I don't know about everybody else, but normally, the turn of one year to the next is not that big a deal to me. Not that excited to see a new day because it's just kind of another month, another day, new opportunities though. And this year I was really excited to see 2020 behind us. I know, unfortunately we still are in the days of the pandemic and have a little ways to go, but just the fact mentally that we've turned the page on the calendar, I think is exciting just from all of our psychological standpoint. If you look at the state of the health of the economy, Texas entered into the dual headwinds of the pandemic, as well as lower oil and gas prices. And as you mentioned earlier, we had seen some softness in the oil and gas industry prior to entering into the month of March. However, that alone had a significant impact in oil and gas. Other industries were drastically impacted, as Laura mentioned earlier, whether it's the hospitality, leisure, travel, vacation areas, hotels, had significant impacts and continue to see a drag. Now, Texas entered into those dual headwinds in a stronger footing than many other states and many other countries. Originally, we had estimated the economy, unfortunately, was going to be in a recession. We just didn't know how deep, how wide, and how long. Now, as we've gone further through the months, the last 10 months, one of the things I've kept saying is we need a couple more months of data. We need a couple more months of data. And I'm still saying that, in part because there's lots of uncertainty, not only in the economy in the United States, but literally around the world. And one of the points that I continue to stress all the time is that Texas is roughly 19% of all the exports out of the United States, which, to put that in comparison, is by far the largest exporting state in our nation. And I make that point just because we're very tied to the global economy. So things that are happening in other countries have ripple effects in our own economy here in the state of Texas. But in short, as we look at it today, the Texas revenues into the Treasury, principally sales tax revenues, because that's about 60% of all the taxes that we bring into the state Treasury. So all revenue streams are important, but sales tax is the one that significantly moves the needle for the health of the state Treasury, has not been as negative as we originally anticipated. So that's good news. So that has helped one of the situations. Also, a few other things, obviously the federal dollars that Congress has passed and the president signed has continued to put Texas in a little bit better position. So kind of as we see it in short, the Texas economy is in a better shape than we anticipated last summer. And that's really been the case over most state economies, unless you're one of the states that has a much greater percentage of tourism industry, such as Hawaii, say, for example, has been much more impacted by the downturn than Texas has. And so how about we'll just jump into some questions if you want to, and look forward to that opportunity to see what questions you have on your mind today.
Thank you, Glenn. I really appreciate you jumping in to answer some of the questions to help us get a perspective on our economy as a whole. One of the things that, we were talking about just before we started this call is really just the importance of how we continue to be a thriving economy overall, right? We've moved from 10th position to 9th position in terms of the world's largest economy. But obviously, there have been sectors of the economy that were hardest hit by the pandemic. What sectors are critical for our continued recovery from your perspective?
Yeah, great question. Every industry sector is important. I mean, it really is. Whether they're the number one in job creation and economic GDP output, for example, is the finance sector. Most people wouldn't think that. Whether that's banking, insurance, real estate, that's the largest percentage as a GDP percent. Obviously, oil and gas, it ebbs and flows depending on the either good times or the boom or the bust in that industry sector. But it's always, I kind of explain, we're a much more diverse economy than we were in the 1980s. However, with that being said, oil and gas still, it may not be the piece of the cake, but it sure is the icing on the cake. And so therefore it's an extremely important piece. Manufacturing is a big piece. If you look for its job creation, the healthcare industry, the retail industry, all of those are very large contributors for its job creation. And the one point that I continue to make is all industries are important, but the one that is most important for the driver for us to come out of this and continue on a path of recovery, and depending on what that trajectory is going to be, is you and I, the consumer. We're a consumption economy, and a large part of what I've been talking about over the last almost year is that even without government mandated shutdowns, people's behaviors have changed. Now, some of that will be changed permanently. Some of that is temporary. And the point being is, I've continued to stress we all need to do our part to try to instill confidence in others to engage in the economy and balance that, making sure we protect those who are most vulnerable during this time, but also ensuring that we keep the economy moving. And so I think the biggest piece is you and I, the consumer, and trying to do what we can to ensure people have confidence to continue to engage in the economy in the most practical and beneficial way that keeps all of us going in the right direction.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think I myself am actually anxious to be contributing more to the economy with travel and vacation and things of that nature. But obviously, a big critical effort, a critical item that we have to monitor in regards to that is really the vaccine rollout, right? And the ability for all of our people to feel safe when they're out and about in the community. So is the vaccine rollout one of the most critical things to ensure the economy continues to recover?
I think the vaccine rollout is extremely important. It's not just extremely important here in Texas, the United States, but literally around the world. And that's one reason, as I was saying in the introductory, as we're very tied to the global economy, so many pieces of our Texas economy are very tied to the global economy. And so the point is, even if we have a very successful rollout here in the state of Texas, whether we have one in the United States, some states are having a better transition rollout than others, but trying to make sure that the rest of the world. And so therefore, if there are certain regions of the world that don't have a good vaccine rollout, that continues to be a drag on our Texas and our national economy. Obviously, it's important for us, but I think that's one of the most critical pieces is for us to be able to try to get COVID behind us and get to some type of normal level of capability from the vaccine level. I think that's the most critical piece. And just trying to continue to make sure that there's good information and good research that's being conducted, especially as we see new strains of COVID, as we continue to hear about now, and whether the vaccines, are continuing to be effective, how long is the duration. And I just think it's really critical to have good information out there so people are confident, feel good, and moving in the right direction. But yeah, I do think the vaccine rollout is a really critical piece.
We mentioned in our introduction the fact that you've served in both the House and the Senate, right? So you actually have just a lot of experience in terms of the legislature, and which made you, perfect for the role that you're in right now as well. But the House and Senate have put together their initial budget. How do they compare with your estimate, and do they seem like they're starting from a good point, right? Because I can imagine just putting the budget together with this level of volatility is a very difficult endeavor.
It is. I mean, I just kind of real quickly, before we entered the downturn and pandemic, we thought that the current 2-year budget, so everybody, just a reminder, is when the legislature comes into session, we provide them with an estimate of how much we think, and I highlight that word think, will come in the state treasury, because that number really doesn't start in effect for 9 more months. So September of this year is when the 2-year budget starts, and then it runs for 2 years later. So trying to accurately project what all the revenue streams will be in the state treasury is almost impossible. And so one of the things I talk about is, trying to make sure as we see data and numbers change, and obviously there's a lot of data we look at, a lot of conflicting information. One stream may seem to go one direction. As I mentioned, sales tax is not as negative as we've anticipated, which is really good news. But then if you look at severance tax collections or hotel occupancy tax collections, those are still down double digits. And so trying to sift through all that information and project what that trajectory is, well, the legislature has to do the same thing with the expenses side as they're putting a budget together. And so originally we thought this current 2-year budget had a $3 billion surplus a year ago. Well, we got to last summer, concerned what the revenue streams were. And we thought, looking at all the data, maybe it was about a $4.5 billion deficit. Now it's in a lot better position. It's only about $1 billion right now. And so the legislature, for what they filed last week in the House and the Senate, their budgets are actually above the projections that I provided them. Now, at the end of the day, they can't spend any more than we think will come in the treasury because Texas has a balanced budget. Now, and part of the logic with that is they wanted to at least start in a position, because we do have some federal dollars that are being able to be utilized in this budget that had to be expended by the last day of last calendar year, but Congress extended that to the last day of this current calendar year, which has given us some flexibility. And so the point is they started in that position above because we have a healthy savings account balance. We have the federal dollars, and with all those pieces, I'm pretty sure they can get where they started out at, even though they started above my revenue, because there's some other levers that will allow us to get where they're at. And, I think really the logic was they didn't want to start in a position to where, as they knew they had some additional release valves for the budget, they didn't want to start at a very low point. They wanted to start at kind of more of a reasonable starting point. So, to give the projection that the state economy is in a recovery. We are on a trajectory, even though there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think where they started out was probably very reasonable standpoints from my perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, one of the things I indicated in my introduction is, you have a conservative fiscal management approach, and that is very positive to us because we never know when disruption is going to come. And I don't think anyone could have predicted or anticipated what has happened in the last year with COVID. That was major disruption to all of us on a level that we could not have imagined. We were one of the highest positive economies in history, and just in X amount of months, right, just went completely to a different, I think we were I think in the central community, in Texas as a whole, probably around 3 to 4% unemployment. It's all of a sudden double-digit employment, right? And we brought that back under control to the extent that we can. Something that you mentioned that I thought was important is that the legislature knew they had different budgets they could tap. Federal funding is one of them. Obviously, one of our most conversations that always come up is the legislator going to need to tap into our rainy day fund? And that's a question I'm sure you are repeatedly asked, and wanted to go ahead and get that out there and get that perspective from you.
Yeah, if you look at the current budget cycle, not to get too much in the weeds and the numbers, but when I laid out the estimate earlier this month, I said for the current 2-year budget, which ends at the end of August of this year, we're about $1 billion in the hole right now. In other words, they need to reduce expenditures or come up with either a rainy day fund or somehow to plug it. However, leadership last summer instructed state agencies to reduce their expenditures by 5% over the 2-year period. So really those two pretty much offset. Then we have the federal dollars. Even though they have a little bit more expenses they need to pay for, it looks like we'll actually have a positive cash carryover balance at the end of this current budget cycle when we start the new one come September 1. Now, who would have imagined that last March, April, May, June? As you mentioned, we were at 3.4% unemployment in the state of Texas. We went all the way up to 13. The most rapid reduction in GDP and unfortunately people going on unemployment claims that this country has ever seen. And so for us to be able to move back in a positive direction, consumer confidence, trying to engage in the economy is really pretty amazing is my point. And so, as we stand today, the legislature from a state savings account balance, we have net a little over $9 billion. We think we have this conversation 2 years from now would have about $11.5 billion if they don't use any of it. And so amazingly, as we're standing today, I actually don't think they're going to have to use the Economic Stabilization Fund. Now, it's there for an economic downturn if you need it, but I don't think they're really going to have to significantly use it. They may use some of it for one-time expense that, they said, okay, we need to deal with this issue or that issue, whether, pensions, state employee pensions is one long-term liability that I keep talking about is a concern. We need to get on a better trajectory on that issue so we don't end up being a New Jersey or a Illinois, some of those states that's so far out they'll never get their hands around that. And so they've taken good steps on like teacher retirement care, but we need to do it on employee. And so, maybe they use some of those dollars to help put us on a little bit better trajectory. But overall, I think they're in pretty good shape for the current 2-year budget. And as long as the economy continues to move in the right direction, I think the upcoming 2-year budget, even though it'll be tough, they'll have tough decisions to make. We're in much better position than any of us thought we would have been last year.
Yes, so one of the things we want to ask, and by the way, for all of those who are listening in, we do want your questions. So please feel free to use the comments and enter your questions in. We're happy to send that over to the comptroller. Just again, referencing the fact that you have been in the House and Senate, you'll understand how difficult this legislation session is going to be. We haven't had an economy of this nature since, 2011. So, historically, how does this session compare to that in terms of how you think about how you approach the conversation when, you just can't have business as usual. You can't have business as usual conversations. We're in a different environment, in a different situation economically.
Yeah, so for myself, just kind of from a background perspective, I entered the Texas House of Representatives in 2003, and in 2003 we had about a $10 billion shortfall in that budget cycle. And then in 2011, when I was in the state Senate during the downturn of the great financial crisis, we had roughly coming in about $4.5 billion in the current 2-year budget that had 9 months left. And then for the upcoming budget, we thought we had about $22.5 billion. So it was $27 billion to maintain the same level of services. And so 2011 was absolutely miserable. It was the first time the state of Texas did not fully fund enrollment growth in our public schools. And on an average, we were having another 70, 80, 90,000 kids in our public schools every single year, somewhere in the state of Texas of all 1,000 school districts. And so we didn't fully fund that enrollment growth for the first time since World War II. When you don't fully fund enrollment growth, that tells you the budget was in very bad shape. Now, thankfully, the economy in Texas took off after that, and we were able to restore a lot of those cuts. But, the question was, is this a 2011? Is this a 2003? And in fact, I don't think it's really neither. There's no exact event that has ever paralleled what we've lived through in the last 10 months. But I think the combination of several factors. One, sales tax revenues have not been as negative as we anticipated. If you look at the great financial crisis, they were down about 10% for 14 months. Well, as of today, it's been about 5%, which is substantially better than double digits. And that's one. Secondly, the legislature last session worked on 2 pieces of legislation with a lot of stakeholders because the U.S. Supreme Court passed what was called the Wayfair decision. In essence, made sure from a fairness perspective, if you and I go around the corner from our homes and we purchase something at the local retail shop, we pay sales tax. Well, if we go online, and guess what we've done in the last 10 months? Bought a lot more things online.
Yes.
We've been going in that direction, but the pandemic has really drove consumer behavior online. And so from a fairness perspective, to make sure that there's not a competitive advantage, we had worked on a package of legislation, make sure that those marketplace providers, if we go use their platform, people go sell on their platform, they collect and remit sales tax to the controller's office, as same as if they have their own website where they sell directly to us. So we originally thought, Tamara, that would be about $500 million in 12 months. We were wrong, in part because the pandemic drove people so much more online, and it was $1.3 billion.
Oh my gosh.
And so that, if we didn't have that in place, obviously we wouldn't be as in good a shape. And so I keep patting the legislature on the back for actually taking up that mantle and passing that legislation, because that put us in a better shape. And then, as we talked about earlier, also the federal dollars that have come for specific purposes and or for COVID related. And so those 3 components have actually put us in a better shape than what we would originally thought last summer.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting. Like, you actually made me feel so much better just with really understanding the various components by which we have that revenue generation. And I myself was a big online buyer, still a big online buyer. I'm sure my family.
I thought I heard your doorbell ring. I was like,
I know. It feels like Christmas. I get a package delivered every day. It's really not a good thing. So I will say that I have done my part to contribute to the Texas economy. So it's kind of funny. The other thing I was curious about, just to get your perspective on, is real estate. I was talking to several of my friends. One of my good friends is a realtor here in Austin, and she's actually which is strange to me. She's here in Austin, is having a spectacular year. And I know that can be different across the state, but, what are you seeing in terms of impacts to the real estate market during this time? I'm curious between commercial and residential, and what are your thoughts on that?
So residential has held up quite strong. And part of that is because we didn't have a substantial inventory already in the state of Texas, because every morning when you wake up, think about this, every morning when you wake up, there's roughly another 1,000 people that call Texas home every single day. Half of those are natural growth. Half of those are people that moved to the state of Texas from either the other 49 states or somewhere around the world. So Texas continues to grow. So that inventory of homes was already it was on a lower end. Then with a pause of building during the first weeks and months of the pandemic, then now an issue of supply chains, trying to get lumber and shingles because those facilities were closed down, and then trying to make sure that they have enough employees to be able to keep their operation rolling when people are doing quarantine because they may have been exposed or had COVID. So, there's supply chain issues. And so therefore right now, actually in the month of December, we had fewer homes in the market in Texas for sale than what we've had going back in data collected over the last 30 years. And so the supply is tight, which means Prices is definitely a seller's market, not a buyer's market. Then we transition to commercial and retail, which is a little bit more of a question mark. I think earlier you had mentioned other cities and other states around the US, whether that's New York, LA, Chicago. And it's interesting because there's been a redefinition of whether people are going to live in downtown areas, where that's not quite the case in Texas, because we continue to be an attractant for companies that want to relocate or build here, or people to move here. And so therefore, my point being, at least from the commercial space, my office, we have 3,000 employees. We're never going to have the same footprint in those buildings as we did before. There's going to be more of a mix of teleworking, but are we going to use the same footprint? That's a question we don't know. Do we space people out more? And so, my point being, as businesses, what is the footprint? And I think the commercial market in Texas is in better shape than other major cities in the state, is in the country and around the world, is my point. However, with that, there's still a lot of question marks. And in the retail space, we know there's a redefinition going on there and a shakeup to some degree as, people transition more online. And so I think that's the part that's a little bit of a question mark. What is that trajectory? But I do think you're probably not going to see the same number of construction projects that we've had commercially and also from a retail space in the last few years, at least in the immediate time period.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you say that. I mean, there was so much to unpack that you just said, and several points that we'll want to pull up. I will tell you, Comptroller, we have several questions coming in from the audience, which I'm going to get to in just a second. But audience, just hold on. I have a few more questions for the Comptroller first. Something that you just mentioned, which I think is a very important word is supply chain. And I think, you were first to really embrace and really help us navigate through Hurricane Harvey. I'm sure you just remember all of the stress, and just also the awesomeness of Texas, the way we came together and helped serve the Houston community when that happened. But obviously, supply chain is important and can hinder economic recovery. Are you seeing companies looking to reshore operations and really focus on supporting, and preventing actually supply chain disruptions? Because I think that's going to be very essential to our well-being and to that economic recovery.
Yeah, I think, definitely companies very early on started having that discussion and started looking at how they were going to do their business. Obviously, we all know those supply chains don't get shifted very quickly. Some of them can be quick, depending on the size of your operation and how many supplies you use. Others take a little more time. But I think, companies are definitely reevaluating all that. You're going to see more companies doing things locally than they had before, just because of those issues, shipping cost. I mean, my staff and I just earlier this week, we're having a big discussion about some of the issues that you see in marine shipping around the world right now, or, at the docks. Are they able to offload all the cargo because they don't have the same number of people before, and whether you're able to have from a timeline to ship things back in the cargo, or whether you shipping back empty. And so that whole supply chain issue has really changed. From a fundamental standpoint. Just look at one of the biggest industries that have been impacted is the restaurant business. And so therefore, when schools were closed, restaurants were closed, you remember going to the grocery store and how packed it was, and certain items weren't there. Well, because the way we fed ourselves got disrupted literally overnight. And so therefore, the place that we fed children at the public schools didn't happen anymore. Now it's being transitioned to home. And so trying to readapt those supply chains was very, very difficult for a lot of companies and a lot of businesses and people. And I just use that as an example. But yeah, in short, we do think more companies are going to want to onshore than they have in the past.
Yeah, I will just say personally, for those who probably don't really care, but I will tell you, having to go to the grocery store so much and not be able to go to a restaurant was problematic for me, because I really don't like to cook. So let me get into this one question, and I'm going to go to the questions that we have here in the chat. But Glenn, you've always been about education, right? You have your own kids in education. We've talked about that, the importance of keeping them in cycle and just balancing through. And so, you've talked about the need of continuing to invest in education as a smart way that makes good of use of limited resources. Do you think the legislature will be able to deliver on the promises made last session when it comes to education?
I think they will. I think, the fact is the budget looks in better shape than we did when we thought last summer, thankfully, from those variety of factors I mentioned earlier. And so the legislature, as I've talked to members of both parties, regardless of where they're at, suburban, urban, rural areas, everyone's wanted to keep those commitments. And so I think they're going to keep those commitments. I think the question becomes in the next 2-year, 4-year, 6-year budgets, because they made a significant commitment, at least from the state side for funding. It really depends on the trajectory of the state economy. And people ask me, well, which tax stream is the most important? And, the fact is, at least I firmly kind of believe if you look at different countries and states and tax revenues, we don't have an income tax. We're not going to have an income tax in Texas. We're more of a sales tax and property tax based state, which obviously property taxes are one that, really drives, unfortunately, people's behavior because the price impact in Texas compared to other states. So trying to maintain those at a lower level, which is part of what the legislature took big steps to do last session. And so to be able to keep that, I think the biggest key piece is keeping the state economy moving in the right direction. That's the biggest key piece for them to be able to keep that promise in the out years as we look forward. But immediately, yes, I do think they can.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the state income tax. I actually think that's also a big factor why so many companies have moved here. We were talking about how do we keep Texas attractive for bringing businesses, because you recognize the importance of attracting companies that provides jobs. Whenever you provide jobs, right, everyone's employed. That means the well-being of people and households, and that means there's going to be increased spend, which is automatically going to move into the sales cycle. So sales tax. So it just creates an interesting cycle, right, of attractiveness. So I'm going to move over to the chat here. We do have a couple of questions for you. One of them is, where does the flat tax concept fit into the current Texas tax thinking?
So, it's interesting because at least on a federal level, trying to have a flat tax rather than the system that we have, which is extremely complicated and convoluted. Oh, my goodness. So trying to have a much more simpler concept, I think, does a lot of people a lot of good, make it simpler, easier. And the fact that the state of Texas is predominantly a sales tax state. We don't have an income tax. We do have a margins or a franchise tax, as we call it, from a business perspective. But it's a little different than in other states because so many other states, most of them have an income tax, which is where that area fits in. And so we're a little bit different than other states since predominantly we fund state government off of sales tax and not an income tax basis.
Which I myself personally appreciate. And I apologize, Sandy, if I say your last name incorrectly, but from Sandy Doshin, Ray Perryman, Texas 2036, and others say that Texas maximum drawdown of federal health care dollars, even with the state match, would net out positively in the budget. Does your office agree?
Well, I don't know if it'll net out, positively. If you look at a lot of this question revolves around the expansion of Medicaid, in essence, whether it's a full expansion or some type of state specific type plan, such as Georgia, Oklahoma have moved in those directions. And so there's still really a state match that has to come along, about 10% for that. Now, there are certain pieces that 2036 has talked about, and we do a lot of work with them. They do a lot of great data, provide a lot of information. And so some of those components they've talked about is really a net zero for the state of Texas. But if you go full out, as some states have, there's still a 10% match that the state is going to have to come up with. Now, one of the questions becomes, and I was talking with a legislator about this the other day, is that there are certain dollars that flow into the healthcare system to try to overcome some of the uncompensated care. Now, part of the question becomes, are you able to recapture those as a state, which then becomes part of your share, or is that an add-on, if that makes sense? So I know that's real in the weeds, but the point being is that's where the complexity gets possibly to where you can get rid of that additional state share, which is 10%. But one of the things I've also talked about quite a bit, and we publish every month what we call fiscal note articles, which are a couple issues that are important to the state. We do some special editions. We've done 3 of them related to the pandemic. One, what was the budget going to look like? The most recent one are industry sectors that have been more impacted than others during this downturn. And so I highly encourage anyone to follow those. And we talked about healthcare in one of them, this specific issue, because unfortunately Texas does lead the nation right now still in uninsured population. And that's a population that we've made strides, but I think that's one that we need to keep the focus on, because obviously that's a cost to the rest of us when there's a significant number of uninsured population out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will definitely take a look at those publications, it's important to keep us all educated. You've talked about, earlier the fact that Texas believes in a balanced budget approach, which is something that I think is also exceptionally important in government management. But you've talked about the need to continue to address long-term balance sheet issues. What are some of those, and why is it important to address them?
Well, if you look at the legislature when they're putting a 2-year budget together, obviously, what are the most important things we got to deal with the 2-year budget? I mean, that's the one and only thing they have to do. But one of the things that I've talked about ever since I've been in this role as the CFO, I also need to talk about what are those long-term issues that, we may not see them immediately today. And we say, oh, well, we'll wait 2 more years. We'll wait 2 more years, 2 more years. And the next thing you know, it's 15 and 20 years down the road. And that's an additional cost. It's no different than, say, for example, your own home mortgage. You go, well, I really don't need to pay a big down payment, or let's keep that payment as low as possible, even though I know there may be a balloon payment, for example, on the back end. And then you get on the back end, you go, oh my gosh, why didn't I pay a little more on the front end? And it's the same concept. It's an ebb and flow. Where are the priorities? And so, the fact is we don't have to solve all of them. A couple of the things that legislature's taken great strides on, you mentioned increased investment in public education last cycle. We've done significant investments in transportation, water infrastructure funding. After Hurricane Harvey, there was significant investment in trying to deal with flood control issues here in the state of Texas, which all of those are important pieces. And you go, well, we don't have to deal with, will we have another hurricane of that magnitude? We may not every year, but eventually we will. So how do we become prepared? The one that I focus on more now than ever that I think we really need to take some strides on is our state pension system. So the legislature took some good positive steps to our teacher pension system last cycle, but I think the employee pension system is one that we really need to focus some attention on. I was talking to a few legislators about that this week, of how are some of the ways that we don't have to solve the problem overnight. We just need to get on a path to where we don't have a big unfunded liability in 30 years for the next generation.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I think we sometimes take for granted the importance of our civil servants and how much they do to keep our state moving forward. You meet with the ratings agencies to discuss the Texas credit rating. What are you hearing from them? And is Texas still a good investment?
No, Texas is still a great investment. Texas, we are one of the few states that have a AAA rating. Texas, when we had the downturn in the oil and gas and the manufacturing sectors, principally those two sectors were impacted in 2015 and 2016 when we had lower oil prices back then. The rest of the economy in Austin in particular, Austin economy kept going, the Metroplex kept going. Look around and go, well, what downturn are you talking about? Where Houston, much more based on oil and gas as well as manufacturing, had more of a little bit of a downturn there. And so, what I'm getting at is if you look overall, the state of Texas is much more diverse than we used to be. But how do we deal with those particular isolated issues is extremely important, and making sure that all the components are tended to.
Yeah, I mean, many people argue that Central Texas, the Austin area, has become the second Silicon Valley, right, with the number of tech firms that have moved in. So I think that diversity is really important. I think for myself, I work in the IT space. I really appreciate the fact that I can stay and work here and have a lot of opportunity because of the number of companies that have moved in from that regard. From Oracle to HP now just announcing their headquarters move to Elon Musk. I mean, a lot of just exciting opportunities for all of us, and something we have to focus on. You mentioned infrastructure just a second ago, and you've talked about, I think, in the past, the need to continue to invest in infrastructure. Will things like the State Highway Fund and water infrastructure projects face cuts? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think we're going to be able to maintain all of those. The one piece from a transportation funding is some of the questions last summer was, we had dedicated $2.5 billion for sales tax revenues to transportation funding. As long as you had a certain threshold of $28 billion, the next 2.5 went. And we got there, but if we pulled back too far, would we hit those numbers? And we're going to hit those numbers. Now, the one piece that ebbs and flows, the most volatile stream of revenue in the state treasury is oil and gas severance tax. Now, I provide a chart to the legislature because I show from a historical perspective what sales tax has done over time, what oil and gas has done over time, and a few others. And the reason I point those out is because if you look at the average in the last 20 years, oil and gas severance taxes have increased around, I think, 7-8% on average every single year, way it averages out. But if you look up and down that chart, you can't find a single digit increase or decrease. There's not one. They're all double digit from year to year. And so my point is it's extremely volatile, which what I was going to mention when you asked about the credit rating is that Texas, we were the only state that actually didn't get downgraded that is part of an oil and gas industry. And the reason is because we're a much more diverse economy than New Mexico, Oklahoma, Alaska, which is good for the state of Texas, where, now of all those different revenue streams, they're all important, but that one's the most volatile. And so therefore, because of that volatility, a portion of those severance tax dollars goes to fund transportation. And so there's probably going to be about $500 million less this year than what we originally anticipated to transportation as it was last year, just because the downturn in the oil and gas industry, but still it's going to be a significant amount of money sent over to transportation. But instead of being $1.5 billion, it may be closer to somewhere around $800 million.
No, that's really helpful. So, I appreciate you spending time with us today. I know we've probably tired you out. We just have one final question for you. And we appreciate you spending the time helping us understand all of these different considerations. I think it's important for all of us to have a perspective on how the state is doing. What are some long-term concerns that people aren't thinking about, that we should be thinking about, right, as part of this community?
I think the biggest question is how we continue to go about our behavior. What's really amazing, if you look at the public school system right now, I think before we got on live, folks were asking, are you homeschooling today? And I was like, no, I've gotten all my kids to school. I just got the last two off to junior high. And then here in Katy, they've been in school since day one in September. And it's really amazing. We get a notice every day from the junior high or the high school that there's, somebody that had COVID, but there's no massive outbreaks. I mean, the kids, they wear their mask every day. They go about their business. I think the schools have done a remarkable job in doing that. Now, the fact is, my point is, I think this, unfortunately, we're going to have to continue to deal with COVID for quite some time, even with a successful vaccine rollout. So us as individuals continuing to try to live in a more hygienic way than we have in the past. Glenn doesn't put his fingers in his eyes. I used to do that. I don't do that anymore. Rub my eyes when I'm early, tired in the morning or in the middle of the day after a long day. So, I think some of those things are going to be with us for quite some time, is my point. And then trying to figure out how we mix the new balance of our lives and work, whether it's in person, whether it's outside, and just continuing to make sure the Texas economy moves in the right direction. So I think those are some of the big issues and questions. How is that balance, whether it's school or our personal lives, daily lives, and just kind of stay the course as best we can until we get the pandemic behind us and hopefully get on the right recovery.
Yeah, I think the great thing is we are going to get the pandemic behind us. We are going to be on the road to recovery. We've all changed our personal habits. I'm so tired of antibacterial. I put that on like every day, all day long. But I think, if I think about anything that I would summarize out of today's session is I feel encouraged about our economy. I feel encouraged that even with the disruption that we had, with the unexpectedness of the COVID impact to our economy, it wasn't as bad as it was in 2011, that we are surviving it well, that we're on a trajectory of recovery as we continue to move through the vaccine management capability. I just want to say thank you again, Comptroller Hegar, just for your leadership, contribution to the well-being of the state of Texas. I'm going to turn it back over now, unless you have any final words. Any final words?
No, I just want to say it's always great to be with the Austin Chamber, and I look forward to the day when we're actually in person again. So,
oh my gosh, me too.
Thank you for what everybody does here in the state economy. It's extremely important, and I hope everybody has a prosperous 2021.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Great. Thanks, guys. That was a great interview. Tamara, thank you. Always enjoy how you handle these interviews on Pulse on Policy. And Comptroller Hegar, thank you. I've known you for a long time. And of course, we all know that the linchpin to most organizations is a really good CFO. And today's interview really, for me, makes me feel like we're in good hands, that you got a nice, you balance the short term with the long term so that our economy stays healthy. And I particularly love that you give us all something to do individually that helps the economy. So thank you both for that. And thank you guys for tuning in and for your great questions. I put up here, we've got a lot of content coming your way this legislative session. So you can see on the slide, we've got, first of all, annual meeting is February 3rd. Be sure to tune in for that. Austinite of the Year, as well as some other important awards. We've got procurement opportunities with Cap Metro, with Project Connect coming online. There's some big business coming your way. That's February 11th. Inside the Capitol with the Mexican American Legislative Caucus is February 12th. And Tech Talk with Hugh Forrest, Insights on South by Southwest 2021. It's going to be a different one here on February 16th. So count on us to keep you informed throughout this legislative session. For those of you that are sponsoring the Pulse on Policy series, thank you. If you want to be a part of that sponsorship, let us know. And you guys have a great weekend.